Hello everyone and welcome to Archaeoviking. Today is the fifth video in my series on the earliest large-scale conflicts between Native American nations and European nations in North America. And the eighth video in my series on early colonial debacles that disprove the myth of inherent European superiority. The subject of today's video is what I call North America's 100 Years of War, a series of conflicts known as the Beaver Wars. These were a series of conflicts fought between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and European powers, such as France and Britain, that led to the literal making and reshaping of colonial North America. So before we get into the main topic of the video, I always like to point out whenever I bring up the names of geopolitical regions or geographic regions such as North America and China and things like that, I like to point out how it's when we hear these names, we pretty much across the board think of how they are in the modern day. Now, of course, in the case of North America is a continent, so the continent in itself has not changed in any massive amount over the course of several hundred years, but the geopolitical makeup has. So when we hear in our modern minds the name North America, we probably, and I would say almost most definitely, think of what we see here on this map, this continent that has the countries of Canada, the United States, Mexico, as well as the Central American countries such as Guatemala, Honduras, and Nicaragua. However, while that is a very valid mindset to have, as it's the only way we've known it for the past few decades in our modern world, the geopolitical makeup of North America did not always look like this. It only became this shape after a series of events and conflicts. So in order to better understand how North America became the way it is now, we need to go back a little bit in time to get a better look at the larger picture. So for today's video, we are going to specifically look at the northeastern part of what is now the United States, which is from roughly Minnesota down to Virginia and up through Maine, as well as the southeastern part of Canada, here seen around the Great Lakes and Quebec and the city of Ottawa. Which leads us to our next section, Native American tribes in northeastern North America before European colonization. So before, as well as at the onset of European colonization, the northeastern part of the U.S. and the southeastern part of Canada was already a politically complex and diverse region, home to several very complex indigenous nations, such as the Powhatan, the Sac and Fox, and of course the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, more commonly known as the Iroquois Confederacy, but as Iroquois is a imposed colonial term, it's important to note that the preferred term by the Confederacy is Haudenosaunee. Which leads us to our first big section, the formation and the makeup of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. So the Haudenosaunee Confederacy was formed somewhere between 1142 to 1450 CE. There's a lot of debate about when this political entity formed, with some scholars holding to the 1450-ish CE date, whereas others hold to the 1142 CE date. And there's a lot of evidence for both archaeologically and in oral history. I tend to look at the 1142 CE date, as we have archaeological evidence of warfare and interaction between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Mississippian chieftains of the southeastern United States. But regardless of whether or not they were founded in 1142 or 1450 CE, by the time Europeans arrived in North America, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy was already a complex and powerful nation. So the Haudenosaunee Confederacy made its home in most of what is northwestern New York, as well as parts of southeastern Canada. And originally, it was made of 5 tribes. It was actually called the 5 tribes, or the 5 nations. The Seneca, Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida, and Mohawk. Though, as this map shows, eventually they added a 6th addition to that in the 1720 CE in the form of the Tuscarora, who had migrated north to New York after their defeat in the Tuscarora Wars in North Carolina. So, with that in mind, let's take a look at the political structure of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. So, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, as I mentioned just a couple of slides ago, was, for much of its history, made up of 5 allied tribes: the Onondaga, the Oneida, the Cayuga, the Mohawk, and the Seneca. And so, how this confederacy worked is it was essentially an alliance of equals with the Onondaga being the keepers of the central fire, or the first among equals. They had the final say, in a sense, with the 2 tribes, the Mohawk and the Seneca, being the ones who most often protected the greater part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, Haudenosaunee territory, from outside threats, with the Mohawk being known as the keepers of the eastern door, being the easternmost part, and the Seneca being known as the keepers of the western door. And this confederacy was led by a grand council that was very democratic in its makeup. In fact, for those of you who remember my Revolutionary War video, there is quite a lot of evidence to show, textual evidence to show, that the United States, or at least much of the United States governmental structure, was based off of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. So how the Grand Council worked was essentially the Seneca and the Mohawk, the ones on the east and the west, on the outer edges, geographically, not politically, but geographically, of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, would come together to attempt to make a decision, and then they would reach a consensus, and then that consensus would then go to the next 2 nations in line, the Cayuga and the Oneida, who would then reach a consensus and pass that consensus on to the Onondaga, who would based off of that consensus, then give a judgment. And if all nations agreed on the consensus, a decision would be made. If not, they would go back to the drawing board. If the Seneca and Mohawk came to a consensus, but the Cayuga and the Oneida could not come to a consensus, go back to the drawing board, and then on and on and on. And so that's generally how the Grand Council would make its decisions. But what types of decisions would be made? Well, the decisions could include, but not be limited to, things like peace treaties, trade agreements, and of course, whether or not to go to war. With these decisions being recorded on what is known as wampum, which we'll talk about wampum a little more in the video in terms of what it was made of. But wampum, in terms of a record-keeping tool, was used to basically, you took the wampum shells that it was made of, and you would put specific designs and symbols to record these decisions and record events. It was most definitely essentially a form of writing. So this shows in itself that was actually a myth that many Native American nations had no writing, because in fact they did. It was called wampum. And so that's how they made that's what they used to record their decisions on. So with that, you might be asking, well, how are members of the Grand Council chosen? Like, what was their makeup? So the Grand Council was generally made up of, and I may butcher this and I apologize, of Haudenosaunee, or Sachems, or chiefs. They all mean the same thing, from each individual clan. And these Haudenosaunee would be chosen after essentially from councils in themselves, smaller councils than obviously the Grand Council. These councils would be the women and men's council of each individual clan. So each individual clan would hold a men and a women's council to decide who would be their representative in the Grand Council. And then once both of these councils, the men and the women's council, came to a consensus, they would advise the three clan mothers on who they wanted to be their clan's representative. And then the clan mother would advise would choose and advise the Haudenosaunee Sachem chief, who would then go on to represent the clan at the Grand Council. And this is sort of how that decision process would have gone in each clan. So the clan would have a meeting where it would give everyone, men, women, children, etc., a chance to speak. And then once the consensus is made and get passed off to the clan mother would then inform the chief of the decision reached by the clan's consensus, and then the clan chief would carry the decision to the council of chiefs of the nation, and the council of chiefs of the nation would come to a consensus and bring that decision to the Grand Council. So now that we've looked at how the governmental structure of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy works, I want to come to this little section here, because you might have noticed that the term clan mothers was mentioned in both of the two previous slides. And you might have noticed how important these clan mothers were. And that's because the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, like most Native American nations, not all, but most Native American nations, was used matrilineal and matrifocal systems, i.e. they were matrilineal societies. So what does that mean? Well, they were matrilineal societies, which meant that the women controlled the property and hereditary status was passed through the matrilineal line. So, for example, my last name is Roberts, which is my father's last name. So, i.e., hereditary status in Euro-American culture passes through the father. And so it is largely a patrilineal system. That's not how it worked in the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. It would be the opposite. So in the Haudenosaunee and most Native American societies, I would have my mother's last name. And then we can go on a little step further and look at the matrifocal aspect of the Haudenosaunee and most Native American cultures. In that matrifocal means when a young couple marries, they would go on to live with the woman's family, and the women elders would be the ones who approved selection of chiefs and sachems, as we talk about in the last two slides, rather than the men. So this is, again, in stark contrast to Euro-American, European societies and cultures, where it would be, say, you would go live with the husband or live with the man's family. Depending on if you still live in that sort of very communal society. And then we go a little bit further and we see that also women were the ones who passed lots of land to their female descendants, regardless of their marital status, rather than it being men who passed down the land to their male descendants. And so with that in mind, that Haudenosaunee society was matrilineal and matrifocal in makeup, we can now take a look at the role of women in Haudenosaunee in the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. Now, again, this says Iroquois, but Iroquois is a imposed term, a colonial term imposed on the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. They much prefer the term Haudenosaunee. So, and it's also important to point out that while this is a very much gender binary system, most Native American cultures had more than two genders. But for the purposes of this video, simply for simplicity, not to erase two-spirit individuals, two-spirit being a Native American term for them. It's only for Native American people. But, not to erase transgender or two-spirit people. So I want to put that out there. But anyways, so with that matrilineal, matrifocal society in mind, let's take a look at the role of women in the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. So, what about the clan mothers? What was their role? Well, obviously, they were the ones who chose and advised the Haudenosaunee chiefs on the basis of both the women and the men's council. Clan mothers had a very strong indirect influence on decisions throughout the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. In fact, it's very important to note that their decisions were taken very, very seriously. Their opinions were taken very, very seriously by the Grand Council, and their position was hereditary. And then, to go broader, women as a whole in the Haudenosaunee Confederacy participated in the women's councils that advised the clan mothers and used consensus. Then, to go on to the role of the men in the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, men were generally the ones who were chosen to be Haudenosaunee chiefs. So the Haudenosaunee were the ones who made the decisions for their nation. They represented their nations and clans in the decision-making of the Grand Council, of course, while still taking the opinions of the clan mothers very, very, very seriously. And they, much like the clan mothers, used consensus. The men, to go back into the broader context of men in the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, participated in the men's council, which advised the clan's mothers, much like the women participating in the women's councils. They participated in decision-making for their nation using consensus, and of course, the Haudenosaunee chiefs were chosen from among them. All right, so now that we've looked at the political makeup and the matrilineal society of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, it's time we move on to take a look at how and where the Haudenosaunee lived. So the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, as well as most native cultures in the eastern woodlands, both the northeast and the southeastern part of the United States, generally lived in large-scale villages or cities that sort of looked like this. Of course, with some variation, but generally this was pretty typical of a village or a city of any native culture in the eastern woodlands. The cultures who lived in the northeast tended to live, such as the Haudenosaunee, tended to live in housing structures like this, called longhouses, which were essentially log cabins made from timber and birch bark. And they could be very long and fit a decent amount of people, and could get very warm and various other things, cool in the summer, warm in the winter, etc. And then within these villages and communities and cities, and even outside of them, the Haudenosaunee, as well as all eastern woodland cultures, would practice a combination of agriculture and hunting. So they would have agricultural fields and terraces and things like that within and outside of their villages, where they would cultivate crops such as beans, corn, and squash, among other things. This combination, beans, corn, and squash, is known as the Three Sisters method of planting. is a method of planting created by the eastern woodland native cultures of the United States. The Haudenosaunee and other native cultures of the eastern woodlands would also practice what is known as horticulture, or essentially the Haudenosaunee and other indigenous nations would use what are called prescribed burns, as I talked about in my indigenous agriculture and foodways video that I'll include in the iCard, or they would burn forests to control what types of plants would grow, and using this they would be able to cultivate beneficial food source plants, which would allow them to collect things like hickory nuts, walnuts, acorns, chestnuts, etc. They would also collect things like wild rice and blueberries, and then they would, or say, for example, animal fat, like duck fat, to create things like this soup you see here, where they are boiling duck broth with acorns, wild rice, and blueberries in it to make a very what I would assume be a very delicious soup. They would, of course, also, the Haudenosaunee and Eastern Woodlands cultures would also hunt, hunting a variety of animals such as deer, bear, foxes, etc. They would also utilize marine food sources. They were adept fishermen, using things like birch bark, baskets and nets to collect the fish, or they would construct these things called fishing weirs, which are these large wooden or stone enclosure fences, where they would have an opening that is very large, sort of like this, very large at the front and very narrow here at the bottom or at the back, which essentially means a fish would be able to swim in but not swim out. So it was a very easy way to collect fish. So using these methods, the Haudenosaunee and other eastern woodland tribes would collect a large variety of aquatic food sources, such as oysters, clams, lobster, crawfish or crayfish, depending on if you're from the north or the south, various different types of Atlantic fish, such as alewife, American shad, Atlantic herring, and both saltwater and freshwater eel. The Haudenosaunee, like all native cultures in all of the Americas, had access to a very complex and very developed trade network, with the Haudenosaunee having access to trade goods albeit indirectly, but still having access to trade goods as far west as Wyoming and Yellowstone, and as far south as, at least in theory, as Mesoamerica, and of course as far north as the Hudson Bay and the seas around the North Atlantic and Greenland. And using this trade network, the Haudenosaunee would be able to get a large variety of trade goods, including but not limited to ceremonial pipes, the stone, aptly named pipestone, that the pipes would be made out of, copper from the Great Lakes, as well as, again, up around the North Atlantic, part of the North Atlantic that is around Greenland, and as I talked about earlier in the video that I would touch on again a little bit, the marine shells known as wampum that would be used in the construction of the record-keeping belts, wampum belts. Okay, so now it is time to take a look at Haudenosaunee warfare. So right off the bat, Haudenosaunee and really all Native American warfare was very different from European warfare. Wars were fought for control of things like hunting grounds, especially as the fur trade became more lucrative, rather than things like conquest and territorial expansion. Also, war served as a way for young men to demonstrate their valor and courage, as this was a prerequisite for a man to be made a chief, and was also essential for men who wanted to marry, as Haudenosaunee women often admired warriors who were brave in war. Furthermore, in the pre-contact era, war was relatively bloodless. In fact, even in the early years of contact between the Haudenosaunee and other Native American nations with European nations, European explorers such as French explorer Samuel de Champlain observed that battles fought between Native Americans, such as in the case of Samuel de Champlain, who observed battles between the Wyandot and the Haudenosaunee, that resulted in hardly any deaths, which many sources, both from Native American and European explorers, state that this was the norm for First Nation wars. We also need to talk about the concept of mourning wars. So mourning wars were when warriors would raid neighboring peoples in search of captives to replace those the Haudenosaunee who had died. It was as I just mentioned, was primarily undertaken for captives. A war party was considered successful if it took many prisoners without suffering losses in return. Killing enemies was considered acceptable if necessary, but disapproved of as it reduced the number of potential captives. Taking captives was considered far more important than taking things like scalps. Sorry, people who have that stereotype that Native Americans were just hungry for taking scalps. The clan mothers would be generally the ones who would demand a mourning war to provide consolation and renewed spiritual strength for a family that lost a member to death. Either warriors would go on a mourning war or would be marked by clan mothers as cowards forever, which made them unmarriageable. The captives taken were either adopted into Haudenosaunee families to become assimilated, or were to be killed after bouts of ritualized torture as a way of expressing rage at the death of a family member. Note, while this may seem barbaric, it's very important to mention that very similar things were being done at the same time in Europe in the form of things such as like brutal inquisitions, brutal tortures like, say, the blood eagle, of course, witch hunts that resulted in the brutal deaths of thousands of Europeans. Cruelty is not unique to non-European peoples, and it is not any more or less brutal than cruelty used by Europeans as well. Too often in history, Europeans and, well, not just Europeans, and cultures like China and Japan would do it too, but for the sake of this video, Europeans would betray peoples like the Haudenosaunee as brutal savages while conveniently erasing the atrocities that they themselves committed on their own people. All right, so with that out of the way, it is now time to talk about the early contact between the Haudenosaunee and Europeans. So the Haudenosaunee are first mentioned, positively mentioned, like as in we know for sure that these are the Haudenosaunee. They are first mentioned in the memoirs of French explorer Jacques Cartier, who went on three exploratory trips of what is now the St. Lawrence area of Canada. And here's a map of his third voyage. And in his voyages, he talks several times about meeting with these people he called the Iroquois, the Haudenosaunee. The next explorer who would then, after Jacques Cartier, who would have contact with the Haudenosaunee, would be the aforementioned Samuel de Champlain, who would go on 4 voyages throughout the Atlantic coast of Canada, as well as into the St. Lawrence River, and even further than Jacques Cartier into the Great Lakes region. And with Samuel de Champlain would come the establishment of the North American fur trade in Canada. which would become a very profitable business, with beaver furs becoming the first sort of monopoly cash crop. As you can see here, here's a graph showing the sales of beaver pelts, as well as the three main um, companies or corporations that had a monopoly on the beaver trade, with nations as well, with the French, Dutch, and the British in the form of the Hudson Bay Company being the three main competitors and three main trade partners of beaver furs with the Haudenosaunee and other Native American nations. And as you can see here in this graph, it would start here in the Northeast and then spread like wildfire throughout the rest of the rest of North America. Samuel de Champlain would also, his coming in explorations would also eventually lead to the founding of Quebec. All right, so now it is time to go into the meat of the video, the Beaver Wars themselves, which lasted roughly from 1603 to 1701 CE. And I say roughly because, again, there are debates among scholars on when the Beaver Wars actually started. But for the purposes of this video, I am choosing the earliest date of 1603 CE. So the Beaver Wars began, or at least seem to have begun, when Samuel de Champlain, formed an alliance against the Haudenosaunee Confederacy in response to what he perceived as Haudenosaunee interference in the fur trade. And this led to a few skirmishes with the Haudenosaunee, and again, it led to that, so him sort of witnessing that battle between the Wyandot and the Haudenosaunee. In fact, that battle where he saw there were hardly any people injured, the two people who were injured were actually at his hand. So as you see in this picture, he's firing a musket at the Haudenosaunee. He would, according to his own words, because they may be unreliable, according to his own words, he hit two either Sachems, the chiefs, Hoyana, or at least two people who were leading a war band, because it was not always chiefs, Sachems, Hoyana, who led war bands. It could be just any willing warrior who wanted to gain some sort of honor. Well, honor is the wrong word, but gain some sort of status and things like that. At the same time as Samuel de Champlain was forming or at least shortly after, Samuel de Champlain was forming this alliance against the Haudenosaunee, the Dutch began to become a major competitor with the French in the fur trade, with the Dutch founding first Fort Nassau, and then eventually founding New Amsterdam, Fort Nassau in 1614 CE, and then Fort New Amsterdam in 1625 CE. And once they established these trading posts, the Dutch would begin trading guns and European goods to the Haudenosaunee in return for furs. In fact, whereas the French were, at least for a time, still using the now outdated matchlock muskets, the Haudenosaunee and other tribes who traded with the Dutch, such as, for example, the Wampanoag, began to get more advanced muskets, which were oftentimes too expensive for people who came to the Americas to, colonize and, get rich, which were the flintlock muskets. Flintlock muskets were much quicker to load and were generally more reliable in terms of them working, how long they worked, and they could be, in some cases, much more accurate. And so as this began to happen, of course, and as the fur trade began to grow, conflict itself began to grow between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and other indigenous nations that were supported by the French, which included but were not limited to the Petun, and I may have butchered that. I apologize. Please feel free to correct me. As well as the Wyandot, more commonly known as the Huron, but more properly known as the Wyandot. Other groups included, of course, the Lenape and the Munsee, also known as the Delaware, the Susquehannock, the Shawnee, and the Erie. So now that we have seen the Beaver Wars begin and the conflict between the Haudenosaunee and their rivals in other Native American nations and the French begin to grow, now we need to look at what may have been the causes of this war. So first off, we need to look at a question. Was this a Haudenosaunee War of Conquest or a Haudenosaunee War for control of the fur trade? Well, first let's take a look at this map. So this is a map showing all, in these red dots, showing all of the French trading posts throughout the Northeast. And you can see they go pretty far all over into Minnesota. And then here is a map of the area of Haudenosaunee influence by the middle of the Beaver Wars. As you can see, there's this, and then there is this. They match up pretty well. This is this idea that it was a war for control of hunting grounds, i.e., a war for control of for a monopoly over the fur trade, is further backed up by the Mohawk defeat, Mohawk being members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Mohawk defeat of the Mohican nation, and the Haudenosaunee expansion into the southern part of the Northeast, i.e., Massachusetts, Connecticut, Vermont, etc., where they would then gain a monopoly with the Dutch at Fort Orange, New Netherlands. A monopoly in the fur trade. And as you can see here, this is further backed up by the increase of sales of beaver and otter pelts to the Dutch between 1624 and 1632. Well, really all the way until 1635. So this in itself backs up the idea, all of these together back up the idea that the Haudenosaunee started as a loaded term, but started the Beaver Wars to gain this monopoly over these hunting grounds in order to better profit off of the fur trade. And again, I say loaded question, loaded statement, because one could argue that Samuel de Champlain started the Beaver Wars. But with that being said, there's another hypothesis that has been proposed by historians, and that is that the Beaver Wars were a series of quote-unquote mourning wars conducted to replenish the Haudenosaunee population that had been depleted due to disease and famine. And this in itself has some pretty good evidence also, as shown in this thesis by Jose Antonio Brandao, titled "Your Fire Shall Burn No More, Iroquois Policy towards New France and her native allies." Again, remember, Iroquois is an improper term. And in this, he, looking at the sources, shows in a graph all of the epidemics and diseases that began to break out within Haudenosaunee territory right around the beginning of the most intense part of the Beaver Wars, i.e. the 1620s and 30s. And as you can see, smallpox and influenza did play a very large part in it did damage the Haudenosaunee Confederacy greatly, or at least was very much present. So it could be either one of these things. I would argue that it was both. And the reason I say that is because, to me, alone, neither of these hypotheses is sufficient to explain why the Beaver Wars broke out. and it sort of, to me, both sort of removes, either adds too much agency to the Haudenosaunee and sort of makes them look like cartoon villains who are out to get rich, while the other one, the disease one, removes all that agency from the Haudenosaunee. So I would argue that it was a combination of both, because there's good evidence for both. There's evidence in the Haudenosaunee defeating other native nations in order to gain the proposed fur monopoly. And at the same time, as you can see here, there's a lot of evidence for the Haudenosaunee Confederacy being impacted by uh, epidemics from diseases like smallpox. So again, I would argue that neither one is mutually exclusive. All right, so with that out of the way, it's now time to take a look at the Haudenosaunee and other indigenous warriors, as well as their weapons on the eve of the Beaver Wars. So, prior to, and as well as during the early years of contact between Europeans and Native American nations, such as the Haudenosaunee, most of the Eastern Woodlands tribes generally, their warriors and soldiers generally looked something like this. They would wield things like war gloves, which we'll get to in a minute, and wear things like birch bark or wooden armor. But of course, after contact with Europeans, the Haudenosaunee and other Native American tribes very quickly took to European weapons like muskets. And in fact, the Haudenosaunee very quickly became well known as very skilled marksmen. And this is generally what they would have looked like during the middle of the Beaver Wars. They would have looked something like this individual, who is a Narragansett warrior, or something like this Huron warrior over here, or this actual Mohawk warrior over here. And again, here's pictures of Huron warriors, but again, they would have still looked very similar. Not exactly alike, but very similar to the types of warriors that the Haudenosaunee would have used during the Beaver Wars. And the weapons that they would have used, as I mentioned, of course, include things like war clubs, which originally had been primarily made of chert, a type of stone, but by this point in time had been completely replaced by metal tools. So metal war clubs like this, metal tomahawks, metal knives, etc. And of course, rather than the bow at this point in time, while the bow was still used, I want to make that very clear, but while the bow is still used, rather than the bow being the primary weapon, the flintlock musket, as you see here, was the primary weapon of Haudenosaunee warriors. Now we need to look at European warriors. So at this point in time, European warriors generally looked something like this. So these are the sort of British soldiers what British musketeers and soldiers would have looked like during the Beaver Wars, during the middle height of the Beaver Wars, as well as other things like the 30 Years' War and the English Civil Wars, with British cavalry generally looking very similar to this French cavalryman or dragoon. And then the French would look something like this. Again, very similar to the British, but not quite the same. This is generally the type of military unit that would have been used in things like the 30 Years' War by the French. And of course, they used weapons like muskets and sabers and things like that. Okay, so now that we've looked at the armaments of both the Haudenosaunee and other Native American nations, as well as the armaments and military makeup of European forces, such as the French and the British, it's now time to take a look at the height of the Beaver Wars. So, after defeating the Mohicans or the Mohicans, depending on the pronunciation, the Haudenosaunee would go on to defeat the Winrow Nation, which was located around the shores of Lake Ontario and Lake Erie, and would gain control over, well, of course, they would take a lot of captives to replenish the members of the Confederacy who had died due to disease and famine, but they would also gain control over the hunting grounds for their monopoly over the fur industry. And here is a map of their gaining that piece of hunting ground here. Remember, it was not straight out outright conquest, it was just control of the hunting grounds. And then after this, sources of furs at trading posts would actually begin to decline. So with that happening, the Mohawks would travel to, and I apologize, I'm probably about to butcher this, to Troy Ribéry in New France to propose peace with the French as well as their allied native nations. And then they would ask the French to set up a trading post in Haudenosaunee territory. But despite this proposal, Governor Montmagny would reject the proposal because he assumed that it was implying abandonment of New France's Wyandot allies. Here is the Wyandot Confederacy here. And so with that, the Haudenosaunee would continue to turn to the Dutch. After all, they had already gained a monopoly of the fur trade in the Dutch New Netherlands. And so after this, the Dutch, who were, of course, oftentimes enemies of the French, would begin to further arm the Mohawk as allies, both against the French, but also against other native nations such as the Wappinger and the Lenape. And then, after that, the Haudenosaunee would begin to regularly raid and eventually defeat the Wyandot. And you can see these various raids here. And you can see as where they began to gain that territory in the 1649 and 1650. Again, hunting grounds. And then after that, the Haudenosaunee would defeat and actually eventually lead to the dispersal of the Neutral and Erie Confederacies. Here is the Neutral here and the Erie here. Throughout 1651 and 1650 through 1656 CE. And you can see all of that here. Because of these continued raids and the Haudenosaunee gaining more and more hunting grounds for their monopoly on the fur trade, as well as the continuing of taking captives to replenish their depleting numbers, the Haudenosaunee's depleting numbers due to disease, the French government would order French commanders Daniel de Remy de Courcelle, I may have butchered that, I apologize, and Alexandre de Prouvé de Tracy, again, apologize for butchering that, to lead the Carignan Salaries Regiment in several invasions against the Haudenosaunee before a peace treaty was signed between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the French Empire in 1666 CE. These invasions would have mixed results, actually, with several Mohawk villages being burned, but the Mohawk had also abandoned them, as it was oftentimes a sort of policy to leave and come back later when a invading force was coming. So, with peace between France and the Haudenosaunee, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy would continue its expansion, eventually displacing various indigenous nations, such as the Lakota, who were pushed out of the Great Lakes region around Minnesota, Iowa, and Wisconsin, into the Great Plains, while also beginning long-term wars with other confederacies. The Haudenosaunee beginning long-term wars with other confederacies, such as the Anishinaabe, apologies for butchering that, and Miami confederacies, with these wars lasting between 1667 and 1689 CE. The Haudenosaunee would also go on to defeat the Monacan and Virginia in 1670 CE. See here. And as you can see, this expansion in the gaining of these new hunting grounds by the Haudenosaunee right here on this map, as I've described. And as you can see, they begin to expand and gain control of hunting grounds like wildfire. Again, remember, this was not outright conquest. Oftentimes, these tribes, if they weren't dispersed, would still live in these regions. And even if they were dispersed, the Haudenosaunee would not live in these areas. They would only come and hunt in these areas. The Haudenosaunee would also participate in King Philip's War on the side of the English, as I talk about in my video on King Philip's War, which I will include in the iCard. They actually participated in the latter half between 1676 and 1677 CE, and then right around that same time, they would go to war with the Susquehannocks, and between 1674 and 1677 CE, and would eventually defeat them. And then, right after the alliance with in King Philip's War, as well as the defeat of the Susquehannock, the Haudenosaunee would then go on to form an alliance with the English through an agreement known as the Covenant Chain, which you can see the sort of ritual and way it was viewed here. It was sealed with a 2-row wampum belt, and this is actually a picture of the original 2-row wampum belt that this covenant, this alliance, was made with. So after this, in 1679, the Susquehannocks, with the help of the Haudenosaunee, would then attack the Piscataway and Matawan allies of the colony of Maryland. Here's Piscataway here, and I believe this is the Matawan, but I could be wrong. It could be just a different tribe, but it also could be a different pronunciation, so I apologize. At the same time, the Haudenosaunee would begin to colonize the northern shore of Lake Ontario, as well as would begin to send raiding parties as far west as the Illinois country. And in doing this, the Haudenosaunee would periodically invade both Virginia and Illinois territory with mixed results. Sometimes they would win, sometimes they would lose. Though the tribes of the Native American nations of the Illinois territory would eventually be defeated, but not by the Haudenosaunee. Rather, they would be defeated by the Potawatomi. All of this happened roughly in the early 1680s CE. So with that came to an end with the final push of the Haudenosaunee into Illinois territory, as well as into Virginia country and Maryland. The influence of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, as well as its population, would reach its height, and the Haudenosaunee monopoly of the fur trade would also reach its height. And you can see this in these graphs here, where you can see that the number of warriors that the Haudenosaunee Confederacy had at its command reached its highest numbers generally between 1661, 1660, up until around 1681, reaching a height of around 2,000 warriors, give or take. And here you can see the warrior numbers from the late 1680s onwards. We'll cover that more later on in the video. And as you can see here in this graph, between 1660 and 1682, the overall population of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy would also reach its height, fluctuating between 23,000 to 30,630 people, with individual tribes such as the Seneca reaching heights of around 18,000 people alone. with other tribes also, like such as the Onondaga, though not reaching the population sizes of the Seneca, reaching a population size of around 7,500. Though, as you can see by these little stars beside these numbers, these population totals are like really, really high. And what they indicate is that the number of warriors went up as a result of essentially captives gained in war, therefore backing up the hypothesis that this was that these were a series of mourning wars, which in itself may have led to a increase in total population, not just the population of warriors. But it's also important to note that European historical sources, European primary documents from like explorers and colonial administrators and such, really do not provide any justification for these massive population increases. But that's pretty par for the course when it comes to European powers talking about Native American nations such as the Haudenosaunee. But regardless of that, as you can see, during this time, the Haudenosaunee was at the peak of its military prominence as well as the peak of its population. And you can see this further evidence by the number of captives taken due to Haudenosaunee raids versus the number killed, and then the number of Haudenosaunee losses due to enemy raids versus the number killed. And as you can see, when it comes to Haudenosaunee raids against rival indigenous nations as well as European colonists, the number of people who were captured far outnumbers the number of people who were killed. In contrast, raids on the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the amount of people killed far outnumbered the amount of people who were captured. And you might ask, well, who were the general? When was the height of this of these hostilities? Well, you can see this here. As we talked about, the height of the Beaver Wars was generally from the 1630s until the really the 1660s, but also until the 1680s. With the primary targets being the attacks on the French and native allies of the French. And again, here's another graph showing that same thing here. So, with the Beaver Wars reaching its height, and with the Haudenosaunee having reached its height and becoming very militarily dominant of the region, hostilities would begin to resume between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the French. And after these hostilities resumed, Jacques René de Brézé de Denonville, again, apologies for possibly butchering that, and Pierre de Troyes would capture 50 Haudenosaunee Sachems or Hoyane chiefs at Fort Frontenac under the pretense of a peace negotiation, i.e., they invited these Haudenosaunee leaders to the fort to supposedly negotiate another peace, but then once they got there, they would capture the René de Brézé de Bonneville and Pierre de Troyes would capture these individuals, these Haudenosaunee leaders, and would ship them to Marseille, France, to be slaves. And this would happen in June of 1687 CE. In response to this deception and the abduction of the Sachems Hoyane chiefs, 1,500 Mohawk warriors would attack and burn the Lachin settlement of Montreal to the ground. So, and then after that, Denonville would be replaced as governor by Louis de Baude de Frontenac, apologies for butchering that, who would recognize the danger created by the imprisonment of the Sachems and would, in the process of going to New France to replace Denonville, would locate the 13 surviving Haudenosaunee leaders and would return them with them to New France in October of 1689 CE. After this would begin an event known as King William's War, which lasted, which would be the next sort of big surge in conflict of the Beaver Wars, and which would last between 1688 and 1697 CE. So the main opponents of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy during King William's War were, unsurprisingly, New France, and then another very powerful native confederacy known as the Wabanaki Confederacy. Meanwhile, the Haudenosaunee would side with their British allies against France and the Wabanaki. And this alliance would go on to become very lucrative between the Haudenosaunee and Britain, with Britain providing the Haudenosaunee during this conflict with a lot of European goods. First, a lot of money, 100 British pounds, followed by 100 pounds of gunpowder and 200 pounds of lead, as well as further money indemnities ranging from 200 pounds to 600 pounds. And then, of course, 400 light Dutch fuses and 100 barrels of powder and other munitions. After all, this is a war, and they wanted to make sure that the Haudenosaunee were well armed, because they were their allies. So, with the outbreak of King William's War, French raiding parties with native allies would begin to attack English settlements, perpetuating, gaining victories and perpetuating massacres such as the Schenectady massacre, apologies for butchering, as well as the raid on Salmon Falls and the Battle of Falmouth, all of which were victories for the French and their native allies. But the Haudenosaunee and the British would also gain a lot of victories, and eventually the war would largely become a stalemate as the French and their allies would continue to raid deep into Haudenosaunee territory, burning many Mohawk villages throughout the 1690s, while Britain and the Haudenosaunee Confederacy would conduct several large-scale counteroffensives against France and its allies, such as the failed Battle of La Prairie in 1691 CE, which, while it was a victory for the French, actually resulted in more French casualties than British and Haudenosaunee casualties. So it was at best a Pyrrhic victory for the French, or a victory that was so costly it might as well be a defeat. During the during the waning years of King William's War, the alliance between the British and the Haudenosaunee would be further strengthened, at least to a degree, by the Haudenosaunee and the British signing a treaty known as the deed from the Five Nations to the King of their beaver hunting ground, more commonly known as the Nanfan Treaty. In signing this treaty, which was signed in July 19th of 1701 CE, the Haudenosaunee would relinquish all of this territory in green to the British Crown, claiming to have conquered it between 20 to 80 years prior. Though, of course, the French did not, and their allied nations, their allied native nations, did not recognize this treaty. But regardless, this was a treaty that the Haudenosaunee signed in order to strengthen their political ties with the British, as well as was, in the British case, a way to get more land for colonization. After this, just 1 month after this, the war would continue to grind into the very bloody stalemate that I had mentioned that it was becoming a couple of slides ago, as well as due to the admittedly mutual agreement of the Nanfan Treaty, but still due to the Nanpan Treaty, the Haudenosaunee began to view the 13 British colonies as a larger threat to their territory than the French. So, with that in mind, and growing tired of the protracted stalemate, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy would eventually sign what is known as the Great Peace of Montreal in August 4th of 1701 CE. In this treaty, the Haudenosaunee would agree to stop raiding French territory, as well as the territory of native nations allied with France, and then would also agree to allow refugees from the Great Lakes to return east. With this in mind, this would eventually lead to the Shawnee, who had been pushed out of the Ohio country and the Allegheny country in a much similar way to, say, the Erie and the Lakota were pushed out of their countries. The Shawnee would eventually be able to return and regain control of the Ohio and Allegheny country. The Miami would also be able to return and take control of Indiana and Northwest Ohio, while the Potawatomi would go on to reclaim Michigan, and the Illinois would go on to reclaim Illinois. And this peace would actually last until the 1720s CE. And here's a picture of that treaty here. So with the end of the 100 years of conflict known as the Beaver Wars, we now need to look at its aftermath. So, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy was, at the end of the Beaver Wars, was still a very powerful political and military entity. But it was also greatly weakened at this point, having seen a steep decline in population, territory, and military size by the end of the Beaver Wars. And you can see this portrayed in this graph here, with the number of warriors available to the Haudenosaunee during its height from 1661 and 1681. Remember, we saw this graph during the section about the Haudenosaunee's height of power. The number of warriors available to the Haudenosaunee Confederacy at this point in time was roughly around 2,000. Staying that way all the way through generally 1689 to 1691 and such. But by 1698 through 1710, we begin to see a decline in the number of Haudenosaunee warriors by about 50%. So by 1698 and 1710, we begin to see the number of warriors within the Haudenosaunee Confederacy go from 2,000 to around 1,000 to 1,100. So again, about a 50% decline in the number of warriors. We see a very similar decline in the overall population of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. However, this decline happened a little later than the number of warriors, with the population of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy in 1689 actually being at its height at around 30,000, as opposed to only being 23,000 7 years earlier in 1681. But by 1698, we also see about a 50% decline in the population of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, much like the number of warriors available to the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, with the Haudenosaunee Confederacy's population going down from that 30,630 number to around 14,590 by 1698, and then going down even further to around 12 to 13,000 by 1710 CE. And as these little star marks show here, talking about these little asterisks here, talking about how these population totals, these very high population totals of 30,000 and 18,000 and such, were probably due to the number of captives taken and assimilated within the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. So it stands to reason that this population decline in 1698 all the way up to 1710 was due to those refugees that were allowed to return to their homelands due to the Great Peace of Montreal. It was due to their leaving the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, as well as, of course, casualties of war. And then here's another graph showing sort of all the losses from the Haudenosaunee population losses of the Haudenosaunee, as well as the losses to the Haudenosaunee up until 1701 CE. Here's another graph further depicting that. After the Great Peace of Montreal, as well as the Nanpan Treaty in 1701, the Haudenosaunee would remain mostly neutral after 1701 CE, and it would actually be the policy of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy to use the fearsome reputation that it had acquired in the Beaver Wars to actually play off the French and the British against each other in order to extract the maximum amount of rewards. Now, before you say anything like, "Oh, this is really cutthroat and yada yada yada," it's important to remember that the British and the French were doing the exact same thing to Native nations as well, and so were the Dutch. But you can see this increase in profits from this playing off the nations against each other, the French and the British, within this graph here, where you can see the Haudenosaunee would begin to receive quite a lot of gifts from the British well after the end of the Beaver Wars and the end of King William's War. In fact, this good example of this sort of playing off both sides against each other can be seen during the part of the War of Austrian Succession seen in the Americas, known as Queen Anne's War, where the Mohawk contingent of the Haudenosaunee would participate in French raids into New England, while the broader Haudenosaunee Confederacy would make vague promises of support for raids into French Acadia to the British, but would then rescind their support after. Essentially, they would successfully delay these things and then eventually rescind their support after it became clear that the British expeditions were going to fail. Because of this obvious playing off of sides, the mayor of Albany, Peter Schuyler, would actually arrange for 3 Mohawk sachems, or Hoyane, and a Mohican sachem, all 4 of them being eventually incorrectly known as the 4 Mohawk Kings. He would arrange for them to travel to London to meet Queen Anne herself in an effort to seal an alliance with the British in 1710 CE. During this time between the 1701 and the 1720s, when the Great Peace of Montreal would eventually collapse, the British colonies would slowly but surely start to gain tremendous amounts of power in the region. Not the British Empire itself. The British Empire itself already had power. I'm talking about the 13 colonies. And with this rise of the 13 colonies, eventually the 13 colonies would negotiate more land cessions, very similar to the Nanpan Treaty, with the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, gaining more land from the Haudenosaunee due to treaties, including but not limited to the Treaty of Lancaster in 1748 CE and the Treaty of Logstown in 1752 CE. And these treaties would go on sporadically between 1722 to 1768 CE, and we'll talk about the 1768 treaty in a little bit. Eventually, continued hostilities between the Haudenosaunee, Britain, and France would eventually lead to the outbreak of the 7 Years' War in North America. Oftentimes, more often the North American part of the 7 Years' War is known as the French and Indian War because of this. And you can see this map here, sort of showing one of the larger theaters was North America, and the allies of the British were the Haudenosaunee. These continued hostilities would also eventually lead to the Haudenosaunee, at least in part, participating in Pontiac's War, uh, the war that resulted in the so-called Proclamation of 1763, or the law that said that no British colonists could settle west of the Appalachian Mountains, and that land west of the Appalachian Mountains was the so-called Indian Reserve. But despite this law supposedly preventing British colonists from settling west of the Appalachian Mountains, various land purchases would occur in would occur despite that, in spite of that law. And one of these examples was the purchase of the quote unquote Iroquois claim. Again, Iroquois is a imposed term onto the Haudenosaunee by several of the 13 colonies, where they would then purchase and lay claim to the Ohio and Illinois country in the so-called Treaty of Fort Stanwix, which would in itself lead to the creation of the Indiana Land Company to hold the claim of all of the Northwest, really until the 1790s. And this would be the final treaty signed between the British colonists and the Haudenosaunee Confederacy in 1768 CE. However, because of this continued encroachment by the British colonists, by the 13 colonies, many Haudenosaunee, such as Joseph Brant, would eventually side with the British against the 13 colonies in the American Revolution. And of course, despite the British losing the American Revolution, these Haudenosaunee who had sided with the British would go on to form the Northwestern Confederacy along with other native nations who had sided with the British in 1783 CE, and they would continue to war with the U.S. and combat U.S. encroachment well into 1795 CE. And then the final sort of effect of these continued hostilities that started in the Beaver Wars would be the again, the siding of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, or at least most of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, with the British in the War of 1812 against the U.S. in order to combat the continued encroachment of the United States. So now, with that out of the way, we need to look at the where are the Haudenosaunee today? Well, the Haudenosaunee are still a political entity to this day. We can see this in the Six Nations of Ontario here with the sign, and here are members of the Six Nations here. Remember, they're now called the Six Nations because the Tuscarora had joined the Haudenosaunee after the Beaver Wars. And in fact, all members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy also have their own nations. Remember, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy was a group of 5 and eventually 6 different nations who came together to form an alliance. And you can see that in the Oneida Nation here. Here are members of the Oneida Nation still practicing their traditions. The same for the Onondaga Nation, as you can see here, holding a belt of wampum. The Mohawk Nation is see here, performing their traditional culture at a powwow. The Seneca Nation, you can see here, holding a meeting at their town hall, I believe, as well as the Seneca and Cayuga tribe, because Seneca and Cayuga tribe in Oklahoma joined together here, and you can see them, the leaders of this tribe holding, or at least some of the leaders of this nation, not tribe, holding a press conference. And then the Tuscarora are also still going strong, well, going as strong as one can expect after 2,500 years of American and British, and then even more years of British colonization. And you can see that here with the members of the Tuscarora Nation celebrating the Tuscarora Migration Project. So, with that, that ends the video. So in this video, we talked about the Beaver Wars and how they were a series of conflicts that could be described as either a wars to gain monopolies over the fur trade, as well as mourning wars to replenish Haudenosaunee populations over the course of around 100 years. And we talked about how these wars had a great impact on the formation of the colonies in North America, as well as the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and its culture, and how the hostilities between the Haudenosaunee, Britain, and France remained, and the colonists in the 13 British colonies remained very much strong well after the end of the Beaver Wars, as we saw in the continued hostilities through the 7 Years' War all the way to the War of 1812. So this was a very, very long and very impactful series of wars. Furthermore, as we saw in this, these wars showed that the Haudenosaunee Confederacy very much could, at least through most of the Beaver Wars, fight toe-to-toe with European powers such as the French and the British, which, as the name of the series, Early Colonial Debacles, that disprove the myth of European superiority, implies. This means that this shows how that idea that European nations were somehow more powerful and superior, or were always somehow more powerful and superior, they did eventually become more powerful. It shows that that was not always the case. In fact, this only happened very, very late, comparatively. After all, if it only happens after 100 years, that's pretty significant. All right, so with that, I'm going to end the video. I hope you all enjoyed the video. If you want to see me cover any of the other subjects I mentioned in the video in greater detail later, feel free to leave a comment in the comment section. And remember to like, share, and subscribe. And I hope you all have a good day.